All right, so to start, I want to thank you for joining us, Ben.
Of course, thanks for having me. It's like we coordinated. We're both wearing the see-through glasses. I thought I
Yeah.
was going to be the cool one during this conversation. Turns out I'm not. You got the cooler background set up.
Yeah.
I'm in a corner, my
No,
reading
yours
corner.
is the more casual. It's kind of nice, that business
Yeah,
casual vibe you've got going. That's
yeah,
it
yeah. I'm
works.
wearing sweatpants. So I'm just
Okay,
going to be like that.
you can't give away, you don't
But
ruin the
it's
mystery.
important. It's important, I think, to be transparent with the people,
Yeah. Okay,
especially your
that's good.
students. So yeah.
All right, so Ben, you are the co-host of the Locked On Wizards podcast. You contribute to Bullets Forever, which is a SB Nation site that covers the Wizards, although it's called Bullets Forever. I almost forgot the name. And then you also contribute to the Washington City paper. So you were kind enough to donate your time, and we are going to talk about basketball, about covering basketball, and I have a ton of questions that kind of go all over the place from students. So we're just going to see what we get through.
Of course. Yeah, I'm excited to see what they got for me.
Yeah, and we should, since you said that's important to be transparent, in the past, how many years ago now? At one point, you took sport and society at Utica College when I was the instructor of that class.
Yeah, so I graduated in 2017. I took it my last semester, so it's been 4 years now. It's amazing that it's been that much
Yeah.
time, but yeah, it's been 4 years.
No, it doesn't seem that long. And I think you've come back and spoke to my class maybe twice at this point.
Yeah, I think this is my second time I
Yeah.
spoke. I think my first year of law school, so 2 years ago.
Yeah, and then it was nice because you were in person and we had the class in front of you. But
Right.
I think I have like 30 questions here, so we'll see what we can get through. And if
Nice.
there's one that seems redundant, I'll just drop it out. But to start, let's just talk about your origin story and how you ended up where you are today. So, what got you interested in basketball?
Yeah, so I moved to Utica, New York, where you taught at Utica College. When I was 5 years old, I was a refugee with my family. It was my mom, my dad, and my brother. I hate to say the cliche term that basketball is kind of a universal language, but it really was for us. Utica is a city of 40,000 people. 10,000 of them were Bosnian refugees, or at least close to it at this point. So it was a way to really assimilate, kind of embed yourself with the culture. Utica is a very impoverished city. We didn't even have a hockey team, so it's not like you had much to do. You had soccer and basketball, and that was basically the only outlets that we had growing up. So I'm a tall, lanky, uncoordinated person, so I couldn't play soccer. I figured I could set hard screens, rebound, and maybe shoot some threes, and that's kind of how I got into playing basketball. But jokes aside, it was really a way to learn about the culture. Some of my best friends I made were through basketball. Learning about, I think, America and the ideals of what it means to be an American through basketball, and that's why I've kind of stuck with it. It's been a huge part of my foundation as a human being, I think, and my growth as a person. So
So, did your family have a history of basketball fandom before you, or was it you arriving in Utica and this was a sport that you got attracted to?
my dad loved hoops growing up.
Hmm.
Yugoslavia was an amazing basketball team.
Yeah.
Serbia still second best team in the world. Loses to the U.S. consistently, but it is what it is. Former Yugoslavian players, I think, make up the second most players in the NBA. You have Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, Goran Dragic, and so on. There's too many to name. So
Yeah, and top play, not
basketball,
just making up players, but like
right?
MVP candidate top players.
Yeah, so there's always the talk that, if Yugoslavia stayed together, if it didn't fall apart, how good that team would have been. But yeah, my dad was a huge hoops fan, and I kind of became immersed in it through him. And he would tell me about the history of the Yugoslavian basketball team, point out some players that I watch highlights, Dražen Petric's of the world, Tony Kukoc, Vlade Divac, and so on. So yeah, my uncles played professional soccer in Yugoslavia, so nothing. I guess nobody in my family played basketball, but it was just if you're from that area, it's just a part of, I guess, life.
So at some point you transitioned from, maybe you had the realization that you weren't going to keep playing as you went forward, and you shifted to thinking about covering the game. How did that even come into the realm of possibilities, right? So I played basketball when my career ended, although I guess I still actually write about basketball too. So maybe I'm guilty of this too. But how did you decide that covering the game was something that you could do?
I loved writing. I loved reading. It's how I obviously learned how to speak the language and whatnot. I love basketball. I fell in love with the Wizards early on. It was probably my favorite basketball team growing up.
Oh,
Gilbert
really? I
Arenas
didn't know that.
days.
So this, you had a history of liking this team.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was probably like 10, 11 years old when I started really, really digging into the sport. And Gilbert Arenas was my favorite player. the Wizards just provided so many personalities and storylines outside of the sport itself, right? I mean, the Wizards were good at the time, but I mean, Gilbert Arenas, this is a guy who was defecating in his teammates' shoes. Um, Seriously, I mean, he
Yeah.
did that, and obviously, I'm sure your students are familiar with. If they're not, I mean, he's notorious for like bringing guns into the locker room. So this team was just incredibly interesting to cover. So many personalities, incredibly interesting to watch. Soldier Boy, they brought to a playoff game to oppose Jay-Z. So there's culture there. Just they were just, for lack of a better word, just a crazy team to watch, and easy to love for that reason. So how I came to write about them, nobody was writing about them, and there was an open position on Fansided Wizard of Oz. It was unpaid, but I was like, you know what? My teachers tell me I write well in English class. I might as well. I watched this ridiculous team anyway. Might as well just put this to use and combine the two. So I did that. Um, there was a kid named DeAndre Priester. This is why I stopped playing and started writing. There was a kid named DeAndre Priester. You probably Google him. A D1 athlete, basketball, football. But like I said, I grew up in Utica. Didn't really have much guidance there. Such a hotbed for athletes. I don't know if you knew this, Professor Green, but so many potential D1 athletes just fell through the cracks because there was no structure there, and he was
Yeah.
one of them. We were playing pickup. I was probably like 13, and he came with boots on, and he threw himself an alley oop off the wall and caught it and windmilled it. And I was like, I could never do that,
Yeah,
and
you
I'll
realize
never.
that there's levels to it at
Yeah,
that point.
yeah. I was like, I'm just gonna write a little bit more about basketball. So yeah, I started writing. Uh, I guess semi professionally when I was 13, 14. Started getting paid covering this team, and I've been doing it ever since. So I'm going on probably like 10 or 11 years doing it. It's pretty insane, but
So I want to point out that when you started out talking about basketball, you were saying this was a way to learn like the beautiful ideals of the United States, to learn about all the positive aspects of culture. And then when you said what you actually were excited about, it was Gilbert Arenas defecating in someone's shoe. So it, it shifted really quickly to be like, oh yeah, it's all the beautiful ideals of of American culture.
well, it's both, right? American
Yeah,
culture. I mean, there's some symbolism there. American culture will tell you that you have the American dream while also taking defecating in your shoe.
yeah,
There's both. I don't think they're exclusive of each other. You can
yeah,
try and make your dreams happen while wearing shoes that have poop in them. That's kind of the American dream. But I think
yes,
they're not exclusive in that way.
yeah. That's actually really good. Why did you decide? So right now, you are still covering sports. You ended up covering a few different teams on your path to get to the Wizards, which maybe we'll get into. But you've also decided to go to law school, right? You decided that you weren't going to commit yourself fully to just being this NBA journalist. So how did you to make that decision to simultaneously go to law school?
I think honestly, being a refugee, my parents making like 20 grand combined, um, I needed an opportunity to live easier. Um, I had an offer from an NBA team my senior year of college, and it was paid poorly. I'll say it wasn't a good. It wasn't even really enough to make ends meet. I was looking for. In
It
fact, I
wasn't
got a
enough to pay rent. Yeah, it wasn't even enough
no,
to pay
not
rent.
at all. I mean, I had a job lined up working at a restaurant on top of that. It was a full-time position. I mean, I understand the allure of covering sports, professional basketball. You're around these pro athletes you play NBA 2K with, and there's a lot of like clout that comes with that, so to speak. But you also have to pay rent and eat, and it's really hard to do that. Practicing journalism and especially covering professional sports. So I had to make a decision. I always loved school. Always did well academically, so I wanted to marry the two. Professor Riddle, who I'm sure you
Yeah,
became
a philosophy
friendly with in
professor.
school,
Yeah.
he sat me down and he was like, Ben, like if you don't do something else, you're probably going to be underpaid for a long time and overqualified for the job you have. And it was kind of a dose of reality.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And he was the sort of person that would be very blunt with you. I know some professors and people are kind of, let you down easy, but he wasn't that person, and he
Mhm.
pushed me in that direction. I talked to some NBA agents who told me like, hey man, you love going to school, consider this. My girlfriend ended up going to law school. So it was all kind of the stars aligned where it was like, I like school. Maybe I can marry the two. I love sports. So I'm still trying to figure out a way to do that. I'm waiting on my bar results, but after going to take the NBA agency exam and talking to some prospective clients in the area. Um, I'm trying to use my background as a Bosnian refugee, and like I said, it's a hotbed for basketball players. That area is so. Trying to communicate with people over there, some people who have great connections to the sport there, and maybe utilize my connection in that way. So Yeah, I guess I don't know if I even
Yeah,
answered
no,
it.
definitely. I mean, it shows the challenges of sport journalism because it relies on this idea that there is that allure that you talk about. So people are willing to make those sacrifices of not being able to make ends meet just because they think that eventually they'll get to talk to their favorite NBA player and you'll get to write about this for a living. And you see the people on TV, right? You see the few people on ESPN who get to be the talking heads. They're making money, but the majority of people are not making money.
Yeah, I covered the Utah Jazz in Utah for a summer, probably like 5 months. That was when Gordon Hayward was making his decision, so they brought me on board to help out. Um, one of the guys who was the beat writer there for decades, I think it's probably like 20 years. And he was like, Ben, like, what are you doing? Literally, he sat me down. It was Las Vegas Summer League. I was in Vegas. Pat Riley sitting next to me.
Yeah.
LeBron James is like 15 feet away from me. Just this
Yeah.
like
All the dreams of the career, right?
all
All
the
the dreams of an NBA
dreams.
fan. Yeah.
And he was like, Ben, like, man, I miss my family. Like, I go, I'm like, I'm not getting paid enough to do this. He's like, I see LeBron I see Pat Riley, it loses its luster. And even at that point, my friends were freaking out. They're like, man, like, dude, LeBron's right there. And I'm just like, crap, like, it's
Yeah.
not there for me anymore. It's cool,
And
but
you
it's
were
only
like
cool
20 and you
for
were
a
like
little
20 years
bit.
old then, right?
Right. But I had been covering the sport for
Yeah.
7 years. So I'd already interviewed a ton of NBA players and had gone to press conferences, gone to media days. And it was like, this is really cool, but I'm still poor. And you can only accept that. I think for me personally, I could only accept that for so long and suffer for so long um, without trying something different and trying to, I guess, navigate your love for the sport and your passion in a way that's sustainable. Because I think, the people I worked with in Salt Lake City, they were 40, 50 years old and they were still struggling and they've been at it for years. And that just personally, I just wasn't willing to make that sacrifice.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting position to be in because you're covering teams that have so much money, right? So
Right.
much disposable cash. And there's all these players that you're covering and coaches that are making millions and millions of dollars.
Right.
And then you, the person writing about it, again, you're working at a restaurant, be able to pay to do the thing, right? To pay to
Right,
provide this
and
service to the team.
that's what was so frustrating to me in my conversations with you when I got that offer from an NBA team. I was just like, this team is worth literally $2.5 billion. I know they can afford to pay me 10,000 more dollars. It would
Yeah.
be nothing. They would be absolutely forgettable. Yet they choose not to because they understand that if I don't take the position, there's going to be someone
There's another
equally
21-year-old who
qualified.
will do it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And the industry has changed in such a way where you might have that job for 3 months and then they might kick you to the curb and then you're left without a job and searching for that again. And it's a really difficult thing to to make sustainable. And there aren't very many people who can do it.
Okay, so let's talk about how you ended up in your current position because you had this offer to head out to Minneapolis, cover the Wolves. You chose not to do that. And then you head off to law school. And then I find out you're not just going to law school, but suddenly you're the person covering the Wizards. So how did you end up getting back into that system? Or was that the plan all along?
Yeah, it's something that whether or not this agency stuff works out or basketball career works out, which I'm going to do my best to make sure it does. Um, Basketball is just a part of who I am. I think it's just part of who I am as anything else. It really is as my refugee identity, as who I am. It's just a part of who I am, and I can't let that go. I love writing about basketball. I love talking about it. I love the culture of the sport, how it's continuously evolving. It's evolved in ways that other sports simply cannot compare. I mean, you look at how basketball's evolved in just 10 years, from the nuances of the game to how people approach it, the progressiveness of the game, the people who run the sport, how different they are from other people who run different sports. It's just a huge part of me, and I wanted that to remain, even though I've changed courses and careers. So um, I don't feel pressured anymore. I think at times, especially when I was trying to make it in journalism, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure to make it, and now that I don't have that, I can kind of approach it with more honesty than I did in the past, without having to
Oh,
worry
that's
about
interesting.
repercussions, and it's just been a lot more fun, to be honest with you.
So what are your current responsibilities? And we could just focus. Let's just focus on the Locked On Wizards to start. I mean, I guess we could combine the two. They overlap. So what are your current responsibilities?
Um, that's the great thing about my position right now. I don't have anyone like breathing down my neck telling me like you need to talk about this. And um, I cover the team. I do it every day with my co-host Anthony, who is a great friend. We do it every day. We release a podcast, 20 to 40 minutes or so. We have advertisers on it, and we really just talk about the team. And we don't have any connections with the team. They were not their podcast, so we can be honest. I know some people who have strong ties to the team who are afraid to lose their sources, and that was me at one point, where I knew assistant coaches with the team and people within the front office, and you'd really worry about being honest. And the Wizards are unique in that way because there aren't a lot of people covering them, and there are a lot of, and the few people that do are very worried about losing their sources. And it's very clear in the way the reporting occurs. There isn't a lot of honesty in Washington Wizards reporting, even though the team has been horrific and has
Mhm.
consistently made the same mistake year after year. Just a small example: the owner fired a 16-year-long general manager only to replace him with the assistant general manager, and the team is still really bad. And it was a clear um, it was ownership malpractice. And I think if they had the ability to I guess generate honest content, that would be reported on. But you can't find that. I mean, you can
Yeah.
Google it ad nauseum, and you'll never find much criticism about the team unless it's coming from an independent source like myself or one of the few other people that do it.
Mm. So, what do you imagine? This is kind of an abstract question, but how do you know when you're doing a good job with the podcast, right? Like, when do you know that you're putting out something good? What are you trying to accomplish beyond? Obviously, you're having a lot of fun doing it. You're talking with your friend about this team that you're really interested in and the sport that you love. But, like, when do you know that you're recording something good?
You can, I hate to say it, you can almost feel it, right? um, you can feel when it's going well, and the feedback, I think, is huge too, because you are, again, able to be honest and talk almost as a mouthpiece for the fans. And we have access to all the press conferences, we go to those. I still have conversations with people within the front office, some really really higher ups. I know they listen, but we don't have any strings attached to the team, so
Mhm.
we're able to do that. So I think the feedback is massive from the listeners. And just, again, the feeling that you get when you're talking about it. We obviously don't cross the line. We don't personally insult anybody. Not that we ever would, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think just generally uh, getting the feedback and the emails and the messages on Twitter certainly help.
So do you feel like you have a community of listeners that you've helped create with the podcast with this kind of critical content?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, there aren't many people doing what we do. I think we're the most honest Wizards podcast available. Granted, there's only like three Wizards podcasts,
Yeah.
but of the three, we're the most honest out there. We get hundreds of listeners a day, and they all say the same thing, and they admire the fact that we do approach it with the candidness that we do. And it is a tight knit group. This isn't the Lakers or the Celtics or the Warriors where there's you know casual fans. If you're a Wizards fan, you're probably from the DC area, you're from Israel, you're from Japan, and you really care about the team. You're invested because Denny Avdia is on the team. He's from Israel, or Rui Hachimura, who's from Japan. So you have this almost personal attraction to the team that other teams don't have. So that's where I think the Wizards differentiate themselves from other teams around the league.
How has COVID affected your job? So you mentioned that you do have press credentials, so you can go to these events. Obviously, now that has shifted in the format. How have you has COVID hindered you in any way, or has it actually worked well because you're in Albany and you're covering a DC team?
Yeah, it's made it a lot easier, to be honest with you. It's one of those weird wrinkles in the world we're living in. I think a lot of people who cover sports have their lives have been a little bit easier. The idea that you have to go to the arena and talk to the player in person, it's a very cumbersome thing. I think the industry hasn't evolved in that way, and now we're seeing, like, you can do your job from anywhere. You can ask players questions from anywhere. Of course, there are perks to being there, but largely it's removed the hassle of it all. And we have press conferences every day with the team, and we're able to ask the same questions as we would in person. So, and it's a lot easier. I think it's easier for the players too. They don't have to walk around in their towels only for 20 annoying reporters to stick a microphone in their face. Now you just raise your hand on Zoom, ask your question, and go about your day.
I've seen some of the more traditional figures in sports journalism complain that, it hinders building that relationship and getting to have all this small talk. And I always wonder to what degree that's true or them romanticizing how they think the players see them, right? Because there's this idea that the players care about you because I've been hanging around for that long. But like, do you feel like you're missing out on that opportunity for small talk, or is that just one of those things that the old heads in the journalism game kind of just romanticize this as a relationship?
It's probably both. I think there are still some perks to being there. I fostered some really good relationships with players, like you said, with the small talk, the after the locker room, just talking about whatever to build a rapport. But those days have really changed, I think, because the NBA has changed its PR approach. I think players are cautioned not to build a relationship with players
Yeah.
in ways that didn't really exist when Ahmad Rashad was covering the team, and he was basically best friends with Michael Jordan. If you saw the
Yeah.
30 for 30, where he's flying on private jets with him and going to his house, those days are largely over. I mean, you look at the way LeBron James is covered. LeBron James doesn't have a favorite reporter. I mean, Brian Windhorst was really tight with his camp for a long time, but
Yeah.
as you've noticed, I'm sure Brian Windhorst isn't breaking any LeBron James news anymore. These players have become brands, and
Yeah.
it's really hard to access a brand. And that's why I think the reporting has suffered. It's a lot of it. The storytelling only comes from a handful of reporting or reporters, so to speak. They don't. That sort of style of journalism has withered because I think the league has changed its approach, and in a way that players aren't allowed to, I think, be themselves or verbalize what they want to talk about. You know.
Oh, so that brings up one of the things I've noticed is that, and I'm sure you have and you're talking about now, the sports media landscape has shifted pretty dramatically over the last 10 years, especially with the NBA, where you're talking about players building brands. So there's a lot of different types of journalism happening. There's the traditional journalists that we're talking about that make that personal connection and tell those stories. You've got the hot take artists who just get on the mic and say these ridiculous things that maybe they believe, maybe they don't believe. You've got a whole plethora of the stats nerds who can break down, you know, all the different ways of measuring what player is successful, what player isn't successful, or just looking at salary caps. You've got a lot of ex players getting into the media. Where, looking at the landscape, where do you feel like you fit in? Like what style are you?
I used to love storytelling and digging into, specific aspects of players, maybe something interesting they've done. Some of my favorite stories I've written, like the Chris Douglas Roberts story, I love that. I wrote one of my favorites. If you're not familiar, I think he played for Kansas, and he played with, I think it was Derrick Rose. Played in the NBA for a very long time and just decided to quit playing basketball. Became a huge marijuana advocate. Does nothing now but really eat fruit, which is a pro athlete. All he does is eat fruit. Doesn't eat
Yeah.
meat or any of that. Changed his name to Supreme Bay. I had like a 5 hour long conversation with him. That was one of my favorite things because he was a very different person now. He doesn't consider himself a pro basketball player. He's not that anymore. I interviewed Luka Doncic, I think it was last year, and talked to his mom, his grandmother, and I did that in Serbian because he speaks Serbian. That was the first time I ever did an NBA interview in my native tongue. That was kind of interesting. And we didn't talk really about
How did you
basketball.
make that connection, right? Because here's this person who is just becoming one of the faces of the NBA. How do you break in and say, I'm the person who's going to be able to tell this story? How do you prove to them that you're the person to talk to?
I think again being transparent. One thing I did with his mom, his mom, his name is Miriam. My mom's name is Mirjana.
Mhm.
Something as simple as that. And she's Serbian. I approached her and I was like, hey, like my name is Ben Mehic. I moved here from Bosnia. My mom's Serbian. Shares basically the same name as you. Um, so I think they knew that I was probably a little bit different there. I wasn't just this regular person trying to tell a regular story, as I'm sure she's encountered several times. Trying to differentiate yourself there, being a bit more personable and honest there. But to answer your question, I loved storytelling. I've kind of stepped away from that just because it's very time consuming. Some of the best stories
Yeah.
I've written take weeks, if not months, to write. Combing through interviews, doing off the record, on the record interviews, and the data you spoke about takes weeks, if not months. And I haven't really had the opportunity to do that because I've been in law school. But every now and then I have. Last year I went to Rhode Island and wrote a story about Gilbert Arenas. This is the first time I met him in person. That was I noticed one of your students asked uh, if I've ever been intimidated, I think, or
Yeah, ever starstruck by meeting a
so that
player.
was, I
Yeah.
think, the only time I ever had
Yeah.
that experience, just because, again, I grew up on this is the guy who pooped in Andrew Blatt's shoe, right?
He also,
And
to be fair, he also was an amazing player,
oh
right?
yeah, yeah, he scored
Like
60
we
points
haven't
against
mentioned
Kobe
for people who
Bryant.
haven't
Yeah,
watched him, Arenas was an incredible player.
yeah,
Before
yeah,
knee injuries, he was, I mean,
incredible.
he was a prototype for what we see now, from
Yeah.
point guards and shooting guards. So, but
So
also he
yeah,
did those other things.
yeah, which he's more famous for than his playing career, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was the first time I met him and talked to him. He gave me a hug, and I was like, wow, like 12-year-old me is freaking out,
Yeah.
And I got to watch him play at the Big Three. Obviously not the same good Arenas. He ended up scoring 2 points, so that was also a very reflective thing for me, where I'm like, man, I always dreamed about watching Gilbert Arenas, and here he is scoring 2 points, and not the same player he once was, but. Those are stories I enjoy telling, the deeper ones that require a lot of work, which unfortunately we don't get to see nowadays because those stories aren't profitable, and the people that do write them don't really have a platform for it anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems like those stories they have to go the book route, right? It's the few
Yeah,
people that get a book deal and you're writing 200 pages on a specific topic, but it's
right.
harder to find just those few stories.
Jeff Pearlman, if anybody's out there, one of the best sports storytellers on the planet. I've gotten to know him a little bit. Just put out a book about the Kobe Lakers, the emphasis of that, and how that came to be. And it's really nothing. It's the great thing about a storyteller like Jeff Pearlman is sports and basketball is just merely a backdrop, right? Just like it could be a book about hiking, it would be no different. It's about the personalities, the people, how they came to be. Kobe Bryant is a 14-year-old, 10-year-old in Italy, trying to figure it out in Philadelphia, morphing his personality to be more Philly, so to speak, and then continuously evolving as a person, and obviously until his unfortunate passing. So something like stories like that, I think, are riveting and are worth reading. And unfortunately, again, it's hard to come by those. But if anybody's interested, I think Jeff Pearlman is a go-to.
Okay. So a student had a question that's a nice intersection of how to cover sports and the Wizards. So the question is, how do you feel about Stephen A. Smith and his approach to covering professional sports, but especially basketball? And then more specifically, recently there was a big back and forth between Stephen A. Smith and Russell Westbrook, who's one of the star players of the Washington Wizards now. Any thoughts on that type of journalism? What you like, what you don't like about it? Maybe what you learn from it?
It's very profitable. I despised it growing up. I wasn't the sort of person who watched First Take. I don't think it's necessarily contributing any good to sports. I think it removes some humanity from the person. Um, I'm sure Stephen A. Smith talked. I didn't watch that segment for that reason because it's very predictable. If you
Yeah.
watch one Stephen A. Smith segment, you watch them all. Rarely will he talk about Russell Westbrook's contribution in the community or the incredible statistical freak that he's been throughout the course of his career, and that he's set NBA history on virtually any team he's ever been on. That won't get referenced, but the fact that he's not a perfect player will make this segment, and he'll consequently make millions of dollars from Russell Westbrook's imperfections. And I have a hard time um, understanding that. Although I think Stephen A. Smith's criticisms, from what I understand, he was complaining about like his shot selection or whatever. Those are obviously warranted, but the way he goes about things, I think, are more hurtful than helpful.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the things that he's mastered is us getting angry and critiquing him is part of the game, right?
Right.
He knows that. That's us engaging and saying what you're saying is awful or mean or not based in reality. That's okay, right? Because he's still the subject of conversation the next day, and there's a whole industry built around saying the ridiculous thing. We don't know if Stephen A. Smith believes it. It doesn't matter. He could fill. I mean, how much time does he cover on ESPN now? He fills like 4 hours a day
All of
just
it.
talking by himself, right?
Yeah.
You have a co-host that you're friends with to talk back and forth for 40 minutes. I mean, the thing that amazes me, because I have a similar feeling where I've avoided Stephen A. Smith. I think it's very bad. It teaches us, it's a bad model of how to engage with reality and how to engage with what other people are doing. It's sadly been the dominant influence, I think, on how we cover politics now as well, right? Same type of talking head. But he can just talk for 3 to 4 hours a day and just fill that space, which is astounding to me.
Yeah, he's a master talker, but unfortunately, there's only so much you can talk about, and there's a lot of dead air that's filled with nonsensical criticism, and that hurts the
Yeah.
sport. It hurts players. I think Russell Westbrook's wife made a really good point that isn't really mentioned, that it hurts players' careers and ultimately the trajectory of their lives when you're talking poorly about them, and that becomes your reputation. I think, especially as a young athlete,
Yeah, they
when you're
shape the
labeled as
narrative that sticks the whole, yeah.
right, and days later you could be without an NBA job. Or in Russell Westbrook's case, obviously there are some flaws in him being a player that hurt this, but the narrative around Russell Westbrook became such that nobody wanted him in the NBA, which is mind-boggling because he was a top 10 NBA player for a decade or so. And the notion that he's a cancer in the locker room, that he's hard to work with, he's a stubborn NBA player, made it impossible for the Wizards to trade for him without giving up a first round pick. So that hurt. I think his mobility as a player and his ability to control his fate as a player, because this narrative was created around him. But if you speak to anybody in the NBA, Bradley Beal included, who called him the best teammate he's ever had. That's the reputation he has with players, his teammates. But the outside narrative shapes, I guess, his ability to be the player he wants to be, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and it does show the power of the media, right? Where those stories stick no matter how many times we hear a coworker, is one of his teammates, speak in his defense. No matter how much, no matter what we see on the court in front of us, we hear that expert just saying that thing really loudly. And even if we know that the expert is kind of just talking for the sake of talking, it still gets in our head and shapes the way we see the world in front of us. So it's kind of amazing. It's an amazing thing to see, even if you're fighting against it.
Yeah, and teams listen to this too. I mean, look,
Yeah.
if they're trading for a player who has maybe a not so great reputation, if ESPN has created this reputation for them, they're less hesitant to take on this player, and then the cascades into this player not having a job and so on, and makes it really hard for them to come back. I mean, you look at a player like DeMarcus Cousins, who another player who obviously wasn't perfect, but he had a great reputation within the league, and players loved playing with him. Carmelo Anthony too. I mean, Carmelo Anthony should have been in the NBA for a very long time, but he spent a year and a half or so out of it because he had this reputation of being a ball hog, a selfish player, selfish person. When most people you talk to, you couldn't be further from that.
So, considering your criticism of the Stephen A. Smith type persona, and we're using him as a stand-in for a lot of people, right? I think Skip Bayless is a more reprehensible character in almost every way, and also in that same mold. So there's a lot of people out there like that. But how do you make yourself stand out when you're resisting going that route of saying? I mean, do you ever feel yourself falling into that trap of saying, "Well, I'm going to take an overly strong stand because it gets reaction," right?
Never.
Like,
I've never taken overly strong. I would never do anything for a reaction. I think
okay,
honesty is it's not exclusive. I think what Stephen A. Smith is doing is often dishonest, right? He's creating an exaggerated view of maybe a tiny bit of honesty, right? That Russell Westbrook has at times been a selfish player. That doesn't make him a selfish person or a selfish basketball player in totality. We on the podcast or in my writing, you can critique a team, you can critique a player, a person without exaggerating it and making it untruthful. And I think that's the difference. And I think the industry is such that clicks really generate how you do as in your income. That's why Stephen A. Smith gets paid. He's the highest paid sports person on the planet. I wouldn't call him a
ever,
journalist or
yeah,
anything like that because he's not. But um, yeah, he's the highest paid for that reason. He generates the most clicks. We're talking about him, right?
yeah. Um, so you are in a market where the women's pro team is far more successful than the men's team. The WNBA team has won championships. They've been in the finals. The Wizards have not done that for a long time.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is there, you're saying there's a kind of a small network of people covering, of the sports media in DC or covering the professional basketball teams. Is there much attention around the WNBA team? Do you know the people covering? Like, do you have any observations on that?
Yeah, we cover it on Bulls Forever. We've actually won
Oh, you
awards
do? Okay.
for our coverage of the Mystics. They deserve a lot more love than they've gotten. But honestly, locally, they do get plenty of love. I know that's unique to the WNBA because they're generally disregarded. But um, the DC is, I think, a basketball city, and they love the players and they're a very well run organization too, which I think helps. And they're a winning organization. The players go to all the games. They're very supportive. Bradley Beal and John Wall are always at the games, are always making sure to um, help those players get the exposure that they deserve. So I think the Wizards and are unique in that way, and the ownership group owns the Wizards as well, so they make sure to share that sort of attention. I think.
And yet they do such a better job running the Mystics or having people in charge.
Same thing with the Capitals. They own the
Yeah.
Capitals as well, and the Capitals are very good from what I know. So
Yeah, and same with Minneapolis, right? You have the Timberwolves that have been struggling for years, and you have the Lynx, one of the great
right,
WNBA teams of all
exactly.
time, right? Same
Yeah.
city. But it's also I kind of I was falling into the trap a little bit of reproducing this narrative or discourse that people don't pay attention to the WNBA teams, even if it was setting up you to say the opposite. But it's often the starting point, right? We assume that this thing isn't as popular, and we keep reproducing that narrative over and over and thinking about how powerful the story is. All the numbers are showing that. I mean, you could look at the March Madness right now. The women's team was generating more social media attention than the men's team, and yet it always starts out with this idea that they're not, and that it's going to be a surprise when people do actually cover the team. Um,
Yeah, it's a very welcome change, and I think the players, the ones who control the sport, particularly in the NBA, have led the charge there. This isn't a sport that's um, I don't even know how to say it without offending people, but it's a very progressive sport, and I think the players are have that same sort of thinking, and they understand that the female athletes, the women athletes, and the women's sports deserves the same amount of attention. A lot of them have daughters, and that I think that helps. Some Kobe Bryant, again, I mentioned him, was a huge proponent of women's sports, primarily because he had daughters. So I think that's changed the way people perceive women's basketball, because I think the players can lead the charge. They have the influence, and NBA players, and kudos to them, have done that, I think.
And I think it's also exciting to see players coming out and supporting the WNBA because it's good basketball, even without
Exactly.
having that caveat of saying, Kobe Bryant was very outspoken. I have this daughter, and I want to celebrate the game, and I want to give her an opportunity to excel and be one of the best basketball players ever. But to my knowledge, when John Wall and Bradley Beal have been supporting the Mystics, they weren't saying it's because of a daughter, right? It's because that part of the
Right.
this was part of the basketball in the city, and this was good basketball.
Yeah, because Elena Del Don was the best player in Washington D.C., and I think
Yeah.
they'd even acknowledge that, and the fact that Natasha Cloud is one of the best players in the world as well, and so on. The Wizards had a female assistant coach who played for the Mystics. So I think that organization does a fantastic. They don't do a lot of things well, but I
But
think
they do that.
understanding the impact of women's sports, they do a good job there.
Okay, so we've started to transition into some big questions about sports. So I'll jump around a little bit, but these are things students just wanted to get your opinion on a few different topics. Some of the things that have come up already in class, some of the things that will come up. Starting with one of the hot topics, especially at this time of the year, do you think that college athletes should get paid?
Yeah, having just finished law school, I don't think there's anybody who has any sort of knowledge of law that can make a reasonable argument as to why they shouldn't. And I think any people who are trying to make the argument that they shouldn't are doing it for ulterior motive, right? They're probably getting paid by the NCAA. They're probably lawyers for them. Most people would argue that the 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 scholarship itself and the opportunity to go to school is the payment. It's an absurd argument. These people make billions of dollars literally off college basketball players' backs. Shabazz Napier, who I covered in Washington, complained about not having food to eat, meanwhile generating millions of dollars for the UConn basketball program. That's absolutely ridiculous, and there's no reasonable argument for as to why they shouldn't be paid. And hopefully, the Supreme Court rules in a favor that will allow them to eventually get paid.
Okay, next big question. Recruiting has gone to, actually builds off the last one, college athletes being paid, but recruiting and the impact of shoe companies has pushed to younger and younger ages, right? You see first graders being ranked at, top 50 first graders in the country, top 50 second graders in the country. You see sponsorship deals for traveling teams at younger and younger ages. Do you think that there needs to be some sort of protection for athletes at that age, or is just part of the system and it's fine because it rewards kids when they're young? Does it worry you? I guess is the question.
It does worry me because I think kids at that age, you don't want to pigeonhole them as just a basketball player, especially when in what is like half of, I mean, I don't even know. Basically, no one makes the NBA, and to just assume that these kids are going to have an opportunity to do that is I think, living in a false reality. But in a way, I guess I can ask you this, Professor Green: is it much different than targeting a second or third grader who is excelling in academics and perhaps pushing them through programs that help them achieve their academic dreams, and allowing them to go to a Harvard or a Yale at an early age? Because I've known kids growing up who did that, right? They went from second grade to fifth in literally like a year, and now they're in these advanced programs and going to charter schools that we couldn't afford because they're very smart. And in this way, maybe there's a second or third grader who's an incredible basketball player who I guess will be molded in a way that will allow him to make the most money possible when he grows up and live the most comfortable life. Maybe that's perhaps different because you're focused on their physical attributes as opposed to their mental, but
No,
maybe
I
that's a
think
key
that's
difference.
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So maybe it isn't the attention that's bad, and maybe it's not the opportunity that's bad, but it's a question of who's making those decisions and why they're making those decisions, right? Because we can see there's a lot of people whose training is not in coaching, who are interacting with young players, but they're looking to make some money off of it, and the players are seen as disposable. And I think that's a little bit different than
Absolutely.
if you're a third grader who gets to take this engineering class downtown versus if you're being targeted as a basketball player and you're moved to a new school and you get on a traveling team and then you don't grow the 5 inches that you're expected to grow, right? That's so but I think you're right though, because we do tend to separate out skills and think that, oh, well, focusing on someone being good at engineering is different than focusing on someone being good at basketball. They're both skills that can be cultivated. But I guess maybe the amount of money in basketball is what makes it so scary.
Yeah, I think the reasoning behind it too. I mean, kids who are again are being put in these basketball programs, second or third grade, they're primarily being put in those programs because they're viewed as profitable entities at some point in their lives, and I think that's probably a key differentiator there as well.
Okay, so if we answer all the questions, I know we're gonna go way longer. So I'm gonna skip a few questions because I want to make sure that we hit on some of the more exciting ones. But I had this feeling once we got talking, we could probably go for like 3 hours without a problem. Um, so let me skip to I do want to talk a little bit about politics and sports, but instead of focusing on the athletes, I'm really curious about focusing on what the media does because that's something that you actually have some power. You are one of those people. So, do you speak about social justice issues in your coverage of the sport, or do you focus specifically just on what's happening on the court?
Yeah, I think you have to. It's a part of covering the sport, especially the NBA, where a lot of the players have a stake in the social issues. You can't ignore it because it's a part of their lives. And I think to be a good reporter, a good journalist, you have to dig a little deeper and tell an honest story. And that's a part of these players' story, and it's worth telling, especially at a pivotal moment that we experienced just this past summer. To ignore it, I think, is to do it a disservice and to not do your job.
Mhm. Um, how do you feel the NBA has done with this? Right, so the NBA, we could think about when they returned during they shut down for COVID. They returned in a bubble, and one of the things that was very evident is you have Black Lives Matter on every court, right in the center. They had advertisements focusing on various social movements, especially focusing on Black Lives Matter. You had players having the opportunity to speak about these topics. Do you think the NBA has done a good job creating this opening? Do you have any critiques of the way they've handled it?
I think they've done a pretty good job. I wouldn't give them like an A plus, but they're probably as close as you can get, given that they're multi-billion-dollar organization, and understanding that there probably are some repercussions to allowing players to have a voice, which is unfortunate, but it's also the nature of being an outspoken person. But look, the league was okay with the players boycotting games. They lost a lot of money doing so. They gave them some autonomy and having messages on their jerseys and so on, and they donated a lot of money to social justice initiatives. And more importantly, they're not telling players to stop talking about it, and that's really important. The likes of LeBron James, who's the face of the sport, is allowed to talk about it, and in honest ways that might hurt some people's feelings and deter some people from watching the sport, but that's just a part of, I think, being transparent and allowing your athletes to be people, because they are. And I think to ignore that isn't right, and that's why I think the NBA is the best league on the planet.
One of the things that we've talked about multiple times in class, unfortunately, is media's difficulties in covering some issues related to athletes, especially in class. We've talked about sexual assault charges, right? Where you'll hear the media will be talking about Deshaun Watson, and they'll say, "Well, we don't know about his trade value because he has some issues going on," and then let's move on, right? Not seeing this as this topic that you don't even know the right words to say, so you just act like, "Oh, that's just another thing that he has to work through, and then he can get out on the field." Have you have you had, or have there been times, or are there examples where some things just seem too challenging to talk about, so you've chosen to avoid them? Or are there areas that you feel uncomfortable going? This is a little bit of a vague question, but I'm just trying to think about how is it that you, as a member of the media, covers things happening in people's personal lives, but especially when they're things like sexual assault, things like legal issues.
I think that's when factual reporting, you just have to lean on it. I think nowadays a lot of reporters, so-called reporters and journalists, have become accustomed to, and it's become a habitual thing to just inject and assert your own opinion, right? And that's not I think appropriate, especially when you're dealing with a sensitive topic. You have to report on the facts. And Deshaun Watson, I'm not the biggest football fan. I think he's a football player. If he's
Yeah, yeah, he's a
um, yeah, I think if he's dealing with these sexual assault charges, you can report on them appropriately without, you know, um, further hurting his reputation or making it appear as if you're injecting your opinion, because it is what it is. It's very things like that are don't even need much, I think, explaining. They speak for themselves, right? If Deshaun Watson is dealing with these issues, it's pretty abhorrent, and I think you can say that by reporting the facts without injecting your opinion. So I think just leaning on the facts upon reporting on sensitive things is very important. I mean, recently the Wizards, I think, had canceled the game after the Capitol riots, and that was a very weird thing to cover for everybody, even people who cover the Capitol. For me, it was like I've never even thought about writing anything about this yet. Here I am in this position, and what you do there is again talk about what's occurring and why these players care. If a player has a comment about it, you can share those comments. Scott Brooks, the head coach of the Washington Wizards, was very critical of the insurrection and generally the politics of the country at that point in time. And it's okay to put his quotes in there without injecting your own. So I think that's where factual reporting is key.
Okay, so your approach is not to you are not the reporter covering the riots at the Capitol. You are a reporter covering how an NBA team responds to those riots, right? So that's the way that you focus in and still are able to cover it, but still have a kind of a bounded responsibility. Is that what, kind of what you're saying?
Right, exactly. And I think those things speak for themselves. You don't have to say that this was historically one of the worst days in the country. Numerous people died. It was the first time anything like that has occurred in centuries. Um, and you can tell the story by telling the facts and reporting the facts without, injecting your own opinion.
Hmm. Um, so there's a really good question a student asked. It's a little bit of a long one, so I'm going to try to parse it down a bit. But it seems like more and more athletes are asked and almost expected to speak on difficult issues. And then going along with that, we have expectations about them being able to speak about these issues, knowing what to say. We might judge their responses. It also seems the question is staying that also seems like going along with that, there's this blurring between the athlete as a professional performing a job and who the athlete is in their personal life and their personal beliefs. Is there any danger to that line blurring, or is that an exciting thing because we get a more holistic view of who they are?
So if I'm understanding the question, I think it's always, I think, difficult to separate the art from the artist. I don't know if that's kind of where you're going.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's where they're going. Yeah.
yeah, the NBA I think is unique because the players are allowed to voice their opinions, and you're allowed to report on their opinion. Players never going to be forced to talk about it. I think some teams have tighter guidelines as to what players should say. I think they're a lot more PR training than some other teams. But ultimately, a player is going to say what they want to say and act as they want to act within their personal lives. Um, Blurring the lines, I think, is something that a lot of reporters struggle with, especially when a player, maybe like a Floyd Mayweather, who I mentioned, who I've struggled with personally because I love his style of boxing. He's probably the greatest boxer of all time, but he's a horrible person. And I think as a
Mhm.
reporter, it's hard to not reference his personal issues. And I think the same thing, again, I'm referencing again Kobe Bryant, had issues. And I think a lot of players who, or people who covered his death, really struggled with the fact that this was a part of his life and a part of his identity and a part of his legacy, yet there was this difficulty in whether or not we should touch this. So that's always an issue, I think.
Mm. How about we could go to a case that you, I believe, were covering the Wizards when the John Wall, before he was traded, pictures came out where he was at a party, right? And he like flashed a
Yep.
gang sign just for a photo. Um, I mean, this would be an example where the question's taking us about the blurring of how do we treat John Wall as a professional athlete versus here's this photo that gets out and suddenly there's this moralistic response, right? How as a member of the media do you cover that?
What I did with that was I knew from a source that the ownership group, that was kind of their last straw, where they were paying John Wall a lot of money. He hadn't played basketball in about 2 years, and they had high expectations for his return. He had issues with that in the past. I wouldn't even call them issues. They had told him not to do those sort of things in the past, and he had done it again. They told the media they had resolved it, that, you know, hands are clean. We're just going to continue it. We figured this out. But behind closed doors, they were trying to trade him for not that reason per se, but that was one of the reasons why they were trying to trade him. So I think again, leading on the fact on the reporting that this was a reason why they traded John Wall. I know that for a fact. Was it the reason? I don't think so, but it was a part of it. I think again, leaning on the facts, and it's also I think important to point out that um, I wrote a paper in school, and I did a lot of research on how black athletes are covered as opposed to white athletes, and so on. Especially when these sorts of really insignificant issues occur. Rob Gronkowski, I think his name is, played for the Patriots.
Yeah, now he's on the Buccaneers. Yeah.
His whole persona is based on being kind of a reckless person, being a party boy, being a kind of a knucklehead. And then you have a guy like DeMarcus Cousins. You look at the language that reporters often use. Perhaps it's through implicit biases, whatever the case may be. The language that that DeMarcus Cousins was used for similar antics for being kind of a knucklehead when he was 19, 20 years old, when most of us were knuckleheads, um, was way different than what you saw how Rob Gronkowski was covered.
Yeah, and Gronkowski, keep going. I'm looking up Gronkowski's age to make a point while you say
Yeah,
this because I
he's
love what you're saying.
probably like 40, I think, if I were to just throw an age out there. So
Let's
that's
see.
where I'm sensitive to it because I've seen it, and I don't want to fault journalists who've done it. I think it's just the nature of being a human being and what you're conditioned. I think we as people, especially journalists, have to be mindful of the language we're using when we're describing players. I've seen DeMarcus Cousins and John Wall being described as thugs when Johnny Manziel and then Rob Gronkowski and a ton of other people were just called kids, kids being kids. And black athletes, I think, especially ones coming from certain areas, don't get the leeway that white athletes tend to get, and that hurts their trajectory as people and as players and as athletes. And that's why I think reporters have to be a little bit more mindful. And I think that's where blurring lines, I think, becomes a little bit of a problematic thing.
Yeah, and Cousins and Wall are both interesting cases because while they have this criticism, they're also two of the most involved members of their communities, right? So
Right, and that's
in
where
terms,
John
yeah,
Wall was interesting when I was reporting on it. Um, yeah, like he threw up a gang sign, was at a party.
yeah.
He also had donated like $5 million to a homeless children organization in Washington, D.C. He has donated so much of his time alone to helping people in the D.C. area. Um, he started a COVID relief fund through his own money to do this. I mean, there's just countless things that we can name, yet those things were conveniently disregarded in the reporting. And I made sure not to because I think people are complex. And if we're going to tell, a not so good part of him or maybe a mistake he made, it's also important to reference the fact that the good significantly outweighs any bad. And it's important, I think, to at least reference that when you're doing this reporting.
Yeah, so once you leave just covering the court, then you have to cover the whole complex individual, not just the one moment.
Or at least do
Um,
your best to.
yeah. All right, so this is final bigger question, and then we're going to move to a few rapid fire questions to end it up. So I think it's a good one to end on before we get to the rapid fire. You have spent a lot of time and energy related to this thing, basketball, right? Um, Playing basketball, covering basketball, thinking about basketball. What makes it worth it for you? Because you're at this point, you're not doing it for the money, although potentially career if you go towards being an agent, but that's a little bit different than what you've been doing so far. So what makes your current engagement with the sport worth it? Because how old are you now?
25.
So 25. So you've spent, if you added up all the hours, it would probably be like
Too
10
long.
years of your life was
An
just
embarrassing
basketball.
amount.
Yeah. So what makes it worth it?
It's who I am. I know that's kind of a cliche thing to say. I wouldn't know what to do. I mean, you said all the countless hours I spent. It's become routine. It's become something I look forward to. I love the culture of basketball. I love the identities of the players. I love learning about the new players coming in, their backgrounds. Basketball is unique in that way where there's countless cultures and there are countless countries. Myself being Bosnian, um, all the players who make up the league now, I relate to in ways that I don't other sports and other things. Being a refugee here, I struggle with my identity constantly because I feel very much a refugee, even though I've lived here since the year 2000. My parents still only speak Serbian. Um, it's a part of my identity. And I try to hold on. I cling on to it because I don't want to lose it. Basketball helps me do that. Watching Luka Doncic, Nikola Jokic, talking to some of the Serbian players, talking to my father about basketball. It's very much a part of my identity. So what makes it worth it? I think I wouldn't know what else to do. I mean, learning an instrument takes way too much time, I guess.
So this talking basketball is that's your music that you
Yeah,
produce.
it's just I think it's more than just a way to fill time for me.
Yeah.
It's a unique sport, and I think it's a beautiful sport if you allow it to be. And I think the people who play the sport, who make up the sport, make it what it is and make it the beautiful sport that it is.
So that would be a perfect place to end the conversation, but instead we're going to do these rapid fire questions. So
Okay.
just immediate reaction. Nothing. You don't need to have any beautiful answers. I'm just
Okay.
curious your opinion. Questions sent in by the students. I really like the first one. Personal opinion on Thomas Bryant, and I did not know this, but he
Ooh.
was originally from Rochester. So
Wow,
that's where I'm
Thomas
based right now.
Bryant.
This is where Brockport is, just outside of Rochester. So thoughts on Thomas Bryant, who
I
is a
absolutely
Wizards
love
player,
him.
currently injured. Yeah. So what'd you
Yeah,
say?
absolutely love Thomas Bryant. The most energetic player in the NBA, and I say that without any exaggeration. Very very interesting guy off the court. Loves anime. That's his passion. Such a well-rounded player too. He's grown so much since his time in Indiana. But great guy, great basketball player, and I'm excited for him to come back.
Yeah, I had no idea Rochester connection, which is kind of cool. Favorite NBA team ever
Got to be the Wizards. I mean, I grew up watching them, covering them
during the Arenas years.
during the arena series. Yeah.
Were you too young to watch them during the Chris Webber, Juwan Howard
Dude, I
years?
don't even think I was in the U.S. at the time.
Okay, that was the time that I was a fan of the Wizards. So I've followed Chris Webber wherever he's gone. I've been a
Yeah.
huge Chris Webber fan. So that was my time rooting for them.
Oh,
All right,
nice.
so favorite NBA team now.
Oh man, I love the Grizzlies. I love watching the Grizzlies. I think they have a good thing going there.
I thought you might say the Mavericks going with the Luca connection, but so Grizzlies. All right, good choice. Favorite sport other than basketball.
Love soccer.
Okay. Has there been an NBA player that you could not stand on a personal level and it made it difficult to cover them? So if you want, you can
Uh,
reveal that, or you can just say yes or no.
no, I mean the only weird instance I've ever had, and I think I told this to your class last time, was with Larry Drew the second. He was pretty mean to me in person, and then sent me like this kind of mean tweet, and then I saw him the next day in Salt Lake, and he was just kind of weird. But I didn't do anything wrong, man.
Do you know what caused the resentment towards you? Was some
Yeah,
criticism of
he
his
he went
play?
to he went to inbound the ball with his shorts on backwards, and I was like, I'm sitting right behind him. I can't not note this. So I like took a photo of his shorts, and I was like, oh, Larry Drew put on his shorts backwards or whatever, and he hated me for that.
Okay. It's a good lesson to not to tell someone if their shorts are on backwards. If there's anything you learn from this conversation, that's that's the lesson. Uh, what was your best move on the court?
Oh man, off ball screen. Everyone hates it. You get the guy open. It's kind of a screen assist. No one loves to do it, but I think if you do it, you're gonna end up playing 7, 8 games in a row if you're playing pickup. It's a little thing that makes all the difference.
So you were the Rudy Gobert of youth basketball
Yeah,
in Utica.
yeah, exactly. The box out, the mini hook shot. That was the Robin Lopez before Robin Lopez.
um, what do you think is the most important skill on the basketball court? If you're looking at players now, what do you think is the significant thing if you're trying to judge who's going to succeed or not?
Shooting in today's league. If you can't shoot, you'll be out the league in 2 years.
Are you excited about the new Space Jam movie?
I'm excited. Anything LeBron puts out is gold, so I think this will be the same.
Who has been the player or coach that you've had the most fun talking to?
Mm. Martell Webster. I became pretty good friends with. Great guy. He's not in the NBA anymore. He was in the league 4 years ago or 3 or 4 years ago. He's a fantastic guy. Also from Minnesota, I believe.
Hmm. What about coaches? Do you have much conversation with coaches?
Not really. I mean, Scott Brooks, we talk to on a fairly regular basis, but he's pretty professional in that way.
Have you ever traveled anywhere cool? And I'm guessing they want to know where, not just yes or no.
Anywhere cool? I mean, I've been back home in Bosnia and Serbia, but that's as furthest I've went. I think. I mean, I went to Paris last year. That was pretty cool. Amsterdam was awesome if you get the opportunity. The weed stuff aside, it's just a beautiful city.
If you could cover any NBA team, who would you choose?
Hmm. It's a really good question. Huh. I think the Lakers would be awesome just because LeBron's probably the greatest player ever, and having the opportunity to talk to him and tap into his mind and be around him, I think would be amazing.
The correct answer was Nuggets. That's
Why?
that's my favorite team right now.
Oh, really?
I think of them as the Kings 2.0. So I gave up on the Kings. The Kings have just broken my heart too many times. It's just ugly for
Are
like
you
20
still
years.
in Ricky Rubio? Are you still on him, or are you?
I still enjoy Rubio.
Okay.
I would like the Timberwolves to do something, but the Nuggets are the updated version of the Kings. They run the same offense. You can map every current Nuggets player onto every Kings player from their golden era.
Who would be
Um,
Peja Stojakovic?
yeah, that's a tough one. That's what they need.
They need a three-point shooter. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I buy that comparison for us again. I think you got Vlade Divac and Jokic down. I think Jokic is a lot
Yeah,
better.
well, no, but
Uh,
he's a combination of Divac and Weber, right? So he takes
okay,
both
fair enough.
positions. You've got Murray and Bibby are very similar in how they play as point guards,
Okay,
right? They
I
run
can
the
do
high
that.
post offense, it cuts off of it. You've got let's see, who else?
Aaron Gordon can be kind of like the Gerald Wallace type.
Yeah, Aaron Gordon would be Jared Wallace type. I guess Michael Porter Jr. is Peja,
That's
right?
disrespectful to Peja. I can't do it.
Or anyway, this we don't need to go down this route, but that all right. So
Alrighty.
you went with the Lakers. This is an interesting question. The person who sent this in, the student who sent in it, is not old, which you might guess from the question, but Juwan Howard or Antoine Jameson. Kind of throwback Wizards.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. Kudos to that student.
yeah. I need to find out. I have to track down who said that one.
I think in his peak, Antoine Jameson was a better basketball player. But Juwan Howard, again, one of the maybe three players I've ever been intimidated around. Huge, massive figure, has a presence
Yeah,
about him where I was like shaking a little bit before I talked to him.
yeah. I mean, he's a legendary status, and now a
Yeah.
very good college coach. King Kong or Godzilla?
King Kong is too flexible, too durable for Godzilla. Godzilla's stiff.
All right. And then final question to end with, which I think you already answered, but and you could just say that that we should not answer it, but who is the greatest of all time?
It's a complex question. Greatest basketball player of all time.
Yes, yes, greatest
Um,
basketball player, not
I'm gonna
greatest person.
right. I'm gonna go with LeBron James is the greatest basketball player. I think Michael Jordan is the most influential player ever, though.
Okay, good answers. So we are going to end it there. We went just over an hour, pretty good. I feel like we covered a lot. Thank you for
Yeah,
taking
thanks
the
for
time to
having
do
me.
this. I enjoy these conversations. Maybe next time you'll be a burgeoning agent, and
Yeah,
we'll get a different.
maybe if your students can hit the 3-point shot at a high level, tell them to
Yeah.
contact me, and maybe we can get something going.
Yeah. So your plan, that's the route you're going at this point. That's
Yeah, that's. I mean, I've made contact with several players, some who I think have a strong chance to get to the NBA. So hopefully something shakes out there, and I'll of course keep everyone posted and hope
yeah, that'll be a whole
that
different
works out.
conversation. So
Yeah,
thank you again.
of course. Thank
And
you.
I know the students will enjoy this one.
Thank you, Professor.
Let me, all right, stop recording.